Okay, so this is the audio review for Study Guide Exam 1. All right, so for the first one, family as haven, this just means that families are assumed to provide a safe haven from the threats and dangers of the rest of the world. Remember, these are the myths. Family as encumbrance just means that family life is often viewed as inhibiting self-expression and personal freedom. The myth of the monolithic family form, I just mean that, in our culture, it has kind of essentialized that families are a nuclear unit with a mother, father, and children, and that the family has a sexual division of labor, where men are the expected breadwinners and women are full-time wives and mothers. The myth of family decline as a source of social problems just basically says that teen pregnancy, single parenthood, factors like that are to blame for social and economic problems in society. All right, moving on to chapter 2. Human agency just argues that people are not just the passive victims of change, but also active, meaning that they make choices inside of their limited opportunity structures. The family-based economy was just an economy based on family members producing and distributing goods, right? Making the goods themselves and also distributing the goods themselves. The three groups of laborers in colonial America that we talked about were the merchant class, right? Those that had the ability to, actually buy their own shops. So almost like a, kind of like the beginning of what we now consider the middle class. The artisan class, right? People that had certain specific skills, whether it be blacksmiths or other specific artisans that, developed tools that people needed. And the laboring class, basically everyone else whose labor was just kind of used, for that kind of exchange, that financial exchange. All right, moving on to chapter 3. See how quick this is? All right, chapter 3. The doctrine of two spheres argues that men should produce goods outside the home, while women are responsible for production inside the home, right? So the doctrine of two spheres assumes that the world outside of the home is for men, and that the world inside of the home is for women. So the cult of domesticity or true womanhood, right? First, the definition is just that it was an ideal standard of women's behavior where women were expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, right? But of course, the ideal itself was an ideal that was related to social class, as women were expected to not work. It was an ideal that was related to race, as whiteness and white supremacy preferenced white women as true women. And so it basically said if you work, then you're not a real woman. If you're a woman of color, then you're not a real woman. So the definition itself purposefully excluded working women and women of color. All right, the family wage was something that unions fought for really hard in a time period where it was assumed that men were the primary breadwinners of the household, right? So the family wage was an income sufficient to support the family at a decent standard. But of course, it was limited to only white men, right? So when it comes to race and wages under the family wage, individuals who were not white did not receive those sufficient wages, meaning that their wages were insufficient to actually support a family. Let's see, racial control of family life. So obviously we have these certain ideals in the culture, and if we idealize families that are nuclear, or also just that are, very racialized as wealthy, white, right? Then if you're a racial minority, then you're not going to see yourself represented in the definition of standard family in the culture, right? And that can really destroy or just affect your ability to kind of see your own family system as normative or correct. So it just is the way that families are often viewed as deviant if they don't conform to those standards, but obviously you can't change your race. So it becomes an exclusionary standard to make sure that some people are just not included. When it comes to race, labor, and family life, obviously, in general, when it comes to race, the presence of racially defined groups has everything to do with the demand for labor, as a lot of racial and ethnic groups were brought to this country for the purpose of providing cheap labor. So this means that there was not just a racial or ethnic discrimination, but a capitalistic social class motivation for keeping people of color as having low wages, right? So family forms really were affected by this. The reality of that is that people have to adapt to not getting as much money. So the fact that people of color were cut off from social supports, from institutional support that other families have, meant that they had to kind of develop their own forms of labor and their own forms of family structure that were different because of those situations, right? So I think the example we talked about in class was like migrant laborers in the West, and how, your family structure is going to be tied to the nature of your kind of migrant work, right? The fact that if you're like, let's say, a farm worker and you're traveling around with the harvest seasons to pick, fresh things, and that's how you get your financial, support that supports your family, then the whole structure of your family has to revolve around that migration itself, right? So that's one example. All right, moving on to chapter 4. So globalization is just the movement of people, goods, services, capital, and culture across national boundaries. So offshoring and outsourcing are two factors that are related to globalization, or that are products of globalization. So first, they're a little bit different. They have a similar effect of, basically affecting the wages of people in this country and of course around the world, but they're slightly different. Offshoring is when a company moves its production to another country, right? Producing the same goods in the same way, but with cheaper labor. So let's say you take like a automobile factory and you move it somewhere else, or a clothing factory and you move it somewhere else. That's offshoring. Outsourcing is a little bit different. Outsourcing refers to taking a specific task that a company does and transferring that to an overseas company to save money. So outsourcing, we talked about how, oftentimes 1-800 numbers, things like that, are outsourced to other countries. So if you call up your 1-800 for your bank and you get someone in India, it's largely because that specific job at the bank has been outsourced to India, because people have the same level of education, same ability to speak English, but just are willing to get paid about a third the amount of the American workforce, right? So sometimes it's not that the whole business moves, it's just a specific task of the business. That's outsourcing. Okay, so housing was all I really wanted you to know there. I know I had that video and all that stuff. What you really have to know for the exam is just how the housing bubble bursting affected families, right? So obviously many people lost their homes due to foreclosure, ended up on the street, right? A lot of people that were renting were affected as their rents went up, as they had more instability in renting. And also a lot of people, because of the bubble burst, either lost their investments, lost their savings, and really, that takes a big toll on families when it comes to the kind of support, the kind of lifestyle they're able to live. All right, moving on. Gentrification. So this is just the process of converting low-income housing to condos or upscale apartments for middle and upper classes, which transforms neighborhoods economically, displacing the original residents, right? So the fact that there's like 1 million high-rises in Fullerton that cost incredibly high rents. It's largely a way to try to poach people from South County to move up here to put their money into the local economy. But then what happens is all the people who are already living in Fullerton have a harder and harder time being able to afford the area. As wealthier upscale condos go up everywhere, that affects the rents of even the crappier, dumpy places that are right down the street. Right? So gentrification often is all like, it's sometimes called different things like, rejuvenation or things like that. But often the real effect that worries sociologists is the fact that it displaces people who already lived there. Because as the rent prices go up and up and up, eventually a lot of people are just priced out. And that really dramatically affects families that are already living in that cusp of, paycheck to paycheck. Another financial issue is bankruptcy. The one we talked about in class was the relationship of bankruptcies to healthcare costs, right? That catastrophic healthcare needs is basically one of the biggest sources of bankruptcies that families face, right? So someone gets sick, your child gets sick, parent or spouse or someone in the family gets sick, and the cost of just trying to take care of that person, the fact that we don't have support to take time off and paid to be able to support each other, means that this can often lead to bankruptcies for families. Um, Independent contractors, all I'm talking about there is that it's a tactic by companies to often hire people as independent contractors so that they can get away with not having to provide benefits, not having to provide retirement, not having to provide, medical care, things like that, because it's kind of a loophole that in a system that otherwise would force employers to actually provide those things. Let's see. When it comes to this issue of downward social mobility, all I'm looking for there is that, just in general, the middle class has been shrinking for a long time, right? That it basically peaked in the 70s. So in 1973, it peaked, and it's just been getting smaller ever since. And so, as a group, as a whole, and this has to do with the changes that have happened to society since the 1970s. So, such as the costs of everything, like consumer goods have gone up incredibly. Cost of transportation, cost of like cars, gas, cost of healthcare, college, all of these things have risen, but not proportionally or not like just with inflation over time, while wages have remained stagnant during this time period. So nowadays, to be middle class requires not just one breadwinner's income, but a dual earning household, as well as credit card debts, loans, all sorts of things to prop up a middle class lifestyle that isn't financially achievable for a lot of families. Let's see, the Great Recession, obviously, the huge consequence of the Great Recession was that a lot of families faced food instability and were not able to, have enough money to provide the food needed for their families. So as a result of this, the government has really provided more resources. Oh, just kidding. No, they didn't. Actually, since the Great Recession, a lot of those sources that are supposed to provide help for people in that kind of temporary, position when they really need it have actually been cut. So there's been more restrictions on food stamps. Food stamp aid has been cut. The budget overall has been cut. There's a tax on school lunch programs, school breakfast programs, things like that. So actually, the government has taken a harder line stance since the Great Recession has happened on providing food for people that are hungry and starving, especially, for families. And as a result, obviously, that affects how families can actually navigate these things. So they often rely on churches, nonprofit organizations, things like that to fill in the gap that the government is lacking because they just have rescinded those resources. And then some other consequences of the Great Recession for families has been the fact that, because some of the job loss was felt more by men than women, that women have more and more women have become the primary breadwinners in their households during the same time period because parents can't afford the high cost of childcare. Sometimes grandparents are taking over or with either childcare responsibilities or even raising more and more children than before. And married couples are even staying together even though they want to divorce because they can't afford to, right? So those were some of the things that were happening as a consequence of the Great Recession that, people even that were cohabitating decided, they're not going to marry until the recession kind of settled down. Birth rates fell, right, by 300,000 births from 2007 to 2010. And a lot of people opted for the underground economy, meaning, working under the table, things that aren't government or reported to the IRS, whether it's illegal or not, just, kind of trying to find other ways to financially support their families. All right, chapter 5. So, immigration is just the movement of people across political boundaries. And obviously, when we talk about these things, migration has been a huge source of population growth and ethnic diversity in the US. So this has been, a large way that we've kind of changed the composition and demographic nature of our nation over time. And of course, this was largely linked to the need for cheap labor. So chain migration is just when family members immigrate at different times, right? Oftentimes, one family member will go and, gain some sort of stability or foothold and then have, save enough money to have their family come and meet them. Transnational families are families whose members are living in two different countries, right? Like I have a coworker that is Sri Lankan but left there in her teen years because of um, the civil war that was going on at the time period, moved to Britain, Now she lives here in the US, but a lot of her siblings live in Canada, some live in Australia, right? Things like that. So she'd be an example of transnational family. Assimilation is the process by which an ethnic group adopts the culture of the larger society or the mainstream society. Let's see. Obviously, I should have said with chain migration, some factor that's related to chain migration is kind of what we saw in the film Which Way Home, which is actually parachute children. So these are people who actually immigrate to another place without their parents. Sometimes it's to go to school in another country. Sometimes it's to gain an economic opportunity, right? Things like that. When it comes to attitudes towards immigrants, obviously they're often blamed for social problems or, basically blamed if they resist assimilation transformations, meaning if they don't immediately learn English or if they have cultural foods or practices or religious things that they practice that are different from the kind of hegemony of American society, right? So obviously we have this kind of negative view of immigrants as somehow affecting the cultural narratives. When it comes to immigrants and assimilation, there's many ways that immigrants deal with assimilation, right? Some just try to blend into the culture as quickly as possible. Some resist by being adversarial to the dominant culture. Some try to emphasize their ethnic ties in their resistance, and then others move towards some sort of bicultural pattern where they assimilate in some factors and resist in others. When it comes to the new second generation, this just means that sometimes second generation immigrants can clash with their parents' cultural identities or even view their ethnic heritage as deficient, right? Because of cultural stereotypes that they face. All right, let's see here. When it comes to the growth of the elderly population, it is estimated that by 2030, there will be 8.5 million people aged 85 and older, and by 2050, it's expected to reach 19 million people, right? So just the demographic changes that are happening in the elderly population. People over 65 are the largest growing group in our culture. So some of the role transitions for the elderly, you have retirement, right? Which is often a difficult transition as it changes your daily life and can be a loss of meaning, right? Because your meaning often your identity is often constructed in relation to what you do for a living, how you work. Another transition is widowhood, right? The separation from one's spouse and the accompanying loneliness that can happen because of the loss of someone so close. Another role transition is living alone, right? We talked about how in the early 1900s, 70% of widows and widowers would just move in with their families, while today, 70% of those same widows or widowers just live alone. Obviously, when it comes to being a widow, the probability of widowhood increases with age. Also, when it comes to, these kind of expectations of, impending death, the life expectancy in our culture has increased dramatically since 1900, right? It was 50 years in 1900, and now it's around 78 years. That's a significant difference. So, people have to kind of understand how those things differ in relation to kind of understanding their role within the culture. Okay, and then for the questions from the reader articles, the first one is just dealing with marital horizon theory. So what the definition is, right? Just the idea that your parents' views and their beliefs and expectations about what relationships should be or how they should work affects young adults, right? Role theory basically says that different institutions in society give us roles that we enact or behaviors that we follow, right? So as far as how it relates to religion can be a powerful influence on our roles, right? So it affects our behaviors. And of course, it's going to tell us, or often provide us a framework of how we're supposed to act, right? And those kind of religious ideologies then reinforce that you have a specific role. And so this can obviously affect parenting, as most religious ideologies are going to have some sort of role expectations of parents. Alrighty, that's that one. Historical trauma, there I'm just talking about how, just kind of the definition, the idea that past historical events, like, for example, in the reading, talking about genocide and forced acculturation, how that can have not just, obviously life and death consequences for the generation that deals with it, but even many generations later, it can have not just psychological, but physical health impacts of, being a survivor of a genocide, right? Even if it's something that happened generations before you were born. Let's see, benefits of fatherhood. This is basically the answer, right here. That when they did that parenting magazine content analysis, they found that the number one theme for why men should parent was that parenting is fun and enjoyable. And then for the last one here, Disney films. In the other content analysis from reading number 32, basically they did a content analysis of Disney films to see who was actually caregiving in these films. And what they found was that when the way that fathers were portrayed was more central to characters' development than mothers when the mothers were present. So, like, for example, they gave that example of like Lion King, right? Where the mom's present, she's like bathing him at some point. They show her for like a minute or two here and there. But his father, even though he dies pretty early on, is more important even in the form of a cloud to his his character development than his mother is, right? Or another example they gave was Bambi, right? Even though his mother is there and she's present and she's doing some caretaking, it's having to follow his father that helps him understand who he's supposed to be, right? So those are just a couple examples from their examples of their larger content analysis of how, when moms were present, which they mostly aren't in Disney films, then fathers were portrayed as more important. Alrighty, and then the last thing here is the short answer essay question. So this one is based on watching the film Which Way Home that we watched in class. So why have so many parents and children attempted to migrate to the US to work for low wages? Right? So there, obviously, why do you think that is? Right? It's the opportunity structure, or at least the assumed opportunity structures, right? The fact that we really brand ourselves as a place where you can rags to riches, work hard, and get opportunities, right? Even though that might not actually be the case. So, and of course, people are living in such dire economic circumstances that they're motivated to move. Also, the fact that there's so much instability in certain areas, often due to our own interventions politically into a lot of regions of the world, that this causes the instability that makes people just flee. Do you think any law will discourage immigration without economic changes also being made in the immigrant's country of origin? So there, obviously, that's your opinion. I'm not going to tell you what that should be. The only thing I'm trying to point out there is that what I'm trying to say is, do you think you can just create more laws to stigmatize or problematize or put harsher penalties on immigration without actually having any changes made in their countries of origin? So changes made meaning economic changes. So saying, do you think if you make it like a $10,000 penalty to, try to cross the desert, do you think that'll stop people more? Or do you think that that without any sort of economic opportunity happening, changing in where they're coming from, then, maybe those efforts won't be as effective, right? That's all I'm trying to ask there. And then just explain in the why or why not. So when I'm looking at this question for points, right, I'm going to look to see, have you answered each part of the question? Have you fully answered it? Have you developed, a concrete argument for that part, right? So that's all I'm looking for there. So hopefully this is helpful. And there you got it. Exam 1 review.